Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Long Wharf's monthly symposium called Shared Experiences that Connect the Influences of Diaspora on Storytelling in Times of Resistance. My name is David Sorkin, and I'm the professor of modern Jewish history at Yale University. I'm excited to facilitate this discussion with our three dynamic and innovative panelists. The three members are Sandy Fox, a scholar of American Jewish history, Jewish youth and childhood, and contemporary Yiddish culture, and executive producer of Weibelteutsch, a feminist podcast in Yiddish. Sivan Battat, queer Iraqi Jewish artist, community organizer, and educator working across genres in the theater and community, in ritual celebration and beyond, with a particular focus on Arab Jewish cultural organizing. And Melanie Chartoff, actress and author of Odd Women Out, Exposure and Essay and Stories, an artist in residence at the Braid Jewish Women's Theater of Los Angeles, and best known as an actress for her roles in Seinfeld, Newhart, Rugrats, Weird Science, and Parker Lewis Can't Lose. So it's my pleasure to get us started with the first question. Maybe we'll just go in the order in which I introduced you. So who are your people? What communities are you a part of? Sandy?
Yeah, thank you. I thought about that question a lot in advance, and I think that I have a couple different communities. I would say one of my main communities is the community of Yiddishists. So people who care about the Yiddish language, are invested in its continuation. Most of these people are not Hasidic Yiddish speakers, although I also enjoy meeting Hasidim when possible and using language with them. But it's mostly people who've either chosen Yiddish or whose parents chose Yiddish and passed down Yiddish to them kind of against the grain of American monolingualism. So that's one of my communities. I have been sort of, for the last couple of years, splitting my time between New York, where I'm from, and Tel Aviv, where my partner's from. And so I have two really, I have deep connections to two communities in both those places. And what's interesting is there's similarities in a way. It's sort of all of the people I kind of, not all, but most of the people I commune with in those places are sort of generally left-leaning, committed to egalitarian Judaism. A lot of my social life and communal life is based around, Jewish ritual contexts. But as a feminist, for me, finding an egalitarian space is really important. So I'd say that's also one of my main communities in both places.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. Sivan?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for this question. I too reflected quite a bit on this and thought about my journey and the different phases. My understanding of who I belong to and where I belong has shifted over my life. I'm originally from New Haven, and the reason I, came to theater and came to so many parts of myself as an artist is because of the New Haven community of artists. So that was sort of where I was born and raised. But my Jewish community in New Haven was predominantly white Ashkenazi. I'm actually mixed. I'm Iraqi Jewish on my father's side, and I'm white Ashkenazi Jewish on my mother's side. So I sort of moved between different spaces, but my traditional Jewish upbringing, in New Haven and around was really very, very much in an Ashkenazi tradition, whereas my home tradition was very, very, very Iraqi. So I always kind of fluctuated between these two senses of selves. And in, Jewish institutional spaces was told Arab was other, and then would be like picked up by my grandfather shouting across the parking lot for me in Arabic, and just kind of felt this really enormous tug of selves between like, how can I be this other and not, and this sort of fragmentation. So years later, I moved to New York after college and found a really robust community of what I would call Mizrahi Jews. So Mizrahi is a word that comes from the Hebrew word Mizrach, which actually means Eastern, and was traditionally a term that actually the state of Israel used to classify Jews who were from the Middle East and North Africa, as opposed to from Eastern or Central Europe. And it was a derogatory term for many, many years. And there was sort of a revitalization of this term in the 70s as part of Mizrahi resistance movements. And the term is not actually geographically accurate. It includes like Moroccans who are from, west of Israel, Palestine, right? It's not a geographically accurate term, but it has been reclaimed by the community. So I'm in a strong community of Mizrahi Jews in New York City and beyond. And within that community, I particularly organize a lot with queer Mizrahi people, sort of finding our own spaces within egalitarian ritual spaces, building forth our own Mizrahi and Sephardi ritual spaces. And within that community, there are those of us from many, many different regions. I'm Iraqi, but I'm in community with Georgians and Libyans and Tunisians and Iranians and many, 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 many more Moroccans, Yemenite people. There's a very, very rich and robust community around me. And beyond that, I'm also in community with a lot of Middle Eastern folks and Arab identified people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, through my theater work and also through my community organizing. And I would say the final community I really belong to is a broader community of what we call JOCSM or JOCISM, Jews of Color, Indigenous, and Sephardi Mizrahi Jews. And I'm currently on the board of the first Torah Academy specifically for Jews of Color, which is called Amud, and it's based out of New York City, but we've moved on to Zoom this year. And being a board member of that space that is like a specifically dedicated for Torah study for Jews of Color is really transformative and is enormous. And I feel really proud to be a part of that community and to also hold the set of privileges that I have in my own experience opposite my other Jews of color around me, and hold that with accountability and tenderness. So those are a few of the communities, and I'm a theater maker, so I move a lot through Middle Eastern and non-Middle Eastern theater community.
Thank you, Sivan. Melanie.
Oh, fascinating women. Fascinating women. Oh, sorry. Anyway, I am an actor. I started my career in New Haven at Yale and Long Wharf Theater. I became an actor after a short college career, and I have been making a living as an actor ever since, which has put me into a community of primarily left-leaning people who dedicate their lives to directing, writing, starring, producing. And I'm a Reformed Jewess, and I have a lot of lefty liberal friends. And I live in Los Angeles now. I lived in New York for a long time. And in Los Angeles, just seems to have happened that all my friends are Jewish. Now, I didn't really go out to volitionally choose that way, but I have friends of other colors and friends of other genders, but primarily I'm in a sort of assimilated Jewish culture here in Los Angeles. And the wonderful thing is I was made an artist in residence with the Jewish Women's Theater, now called The Braid, whose reach online this past year and a half has been extraordinary. Whenever I write material and perform my material with the Jewish Women's Theater, now called The Braid, I am piped into homes all over the country. Baltimore, I mean, there's so many shuls and JCCs that participate in our programming. We are also participating in HiFlix. I don't know if you've heard of this network. It's online, it's not on the television yet. This distributor has bought up all the Jewish themed films from many nations, Africa, Israel, Greece, Poland, Australia, and combined them onto this network called HiFlix. And my material has been fortunate enough to be featured on some of their programming. And I married a Jewish guy for the first time in my life. I got married at 65, married a really nice Jewish guy. So I have moved a little more intensely into the Jewish spectrum since we got married. His sister-in-law is a rabbi. We celebrate every Jewish holiday now, whereas I would pay homage, but not really attend anything or gather with family or friends. So that's where I am right now. I'm very impressed with all the academic accomplishments of my colleagues here. I'll be interested in hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Melanie, and Mazal Tov on your marriage. We have three really exciting panelists here, and I'm really eager to hear what you have to say in response to some of the other questions that I'm going to pose. The next question is, as a storyteller, please share the working title of your life story and explain it. Sandy?
I don't know if you suffer from this too, David, but as an academic, titling things is one of my biggest anxieties. Like I had to go to Facebook to ask friends to help me title my, working book manuscript. So I'm going to deflect the question by saying that while I'm not sure how I would word the title, if the book is really about my journey with a relationship, I guess, with the notion of Jewish diaspora, I think it would really be about sort of my transition from childhood. I grew up in a conservative Jewish community on Long Island, nearly all Ashkenazi, went to Zionist summer camp and grew up very, very active in Zionist summer camp. And then, like a lot of people in my generation, became, a little bit disillusioned by Israel when we encountered more complexities in college and more information than what I grew up with. And for me, both a sort of more do-it-yourself traditional Jewish practice and Yiddish came into my life around that time of disillusionment. My relationship with Israel remains because I am still there a lot of the time. I speak Hebrew. My in-laws, everyone there are Israeli. But I think my book would really be about that transition from sort of an internalization of this concept of Shlilat Gola, the negation of exile, which is part of Zionism, to really embracing diaspora Jewish culture, so much so that it became my field of academic interest.
Fascinating. Sivan?
Yeah, I also struggled with this question as a theater artist and as a storyteller. I was like, which story, which of the dozens of stories that I walk with and that I carry shall I share? But I think in this one, I'll bring forth this term that is very, very common in Iraqi Jewish communities, and the word is ashtidek, and ashtidek means like idek, right? Id is hands in Arabic, and ek is yours, and so ashtidek, which is, many different Arabic speaking communities say this term very differently, but in my community it means like bless the work of these hands, bless the work of your hands, and it's something that you say if someone cooks a really beautiful meal. You might say to the cook ashtidek, like bless the work of your hands in cooking this meal. But it's also a term that I carry very close to me because I remember, it being said in my family. My grandparents sang it and we sang it to them, and particularly around food, but as a maker and as a creator, and as a person who continues to think about the work of my hands and the work of my life being a blessing, I think perhaps I'll go with that. So ashtidek.
Great title, great word. Melanie?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't had to reach too far. It might have been more stimulating for me if I had to reach far, but I have a book that just came out called Odd Woman Out, Exposure in Essays and Stories. It's up on Amazon. Sorry, I didn't want to publicize Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble. In any case, I always felt like an odd woman out because I wasn't that Jewish when a lot of my community in New Haven and West Haven were Jewish. I also wasn't Christian. I didn't really belong in any social sphere when I was a kid, except when acting became a possibility. I suddenly had a club of geeks and oddballs like myself. So the odd became my community, same as in college, same as in New York City when I moved there. And I felt like an odd woman out, I guess, until I married my husband a couple of years ago, because I was always the third wheel, the left out, the fringe. And now I have a nice big Jewish mishpucha to whom I belong. So I feel a lot less odd, but the stories about the first 50 years of oddness, looking for love in fictitious theatrical places, looking for community when theater is very transitory. I'd be in a play and there'd be an intense period where we all believed in the same story, which to me felt like religion. And then we would disperse to go on to other, gigs. So that's the name of my story. I'll stick with it.
Well, good. Let's make the transition from these wonderful life stories to talking about literature and the arts. How have you experienced literature and the arts as creating the popular impression of the Jewish diaspora? and how have literature and the arts shaped your own sense of self? Sandy? You're muted.
Can I maybe not go first this time?
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Who wants to go first? Sivan, go ahead.
I'm happy to start. I mean, growing up in the United States, the vast majority of the literature and artistic, culture I had access to was about Ashkenazi Jewish history. So I felt like a very clear understanding of that history. Fun fact, my father courted my mother through a community theater production of Fiddler on the Roof in Stratford, Connecticut in the 1970s. So there are a lot of sweet histories and memories of Fiddler as part of that upbringing and as part of shaping that story. But Fiddler wasn't the story I was raised with. My Iraqi grandparents lived with us in Connecticut for many, many years. And the language in our household was Arabic, Hebrew, and English, not very much Yiddish at all. So Fiddler wasn't close to my story, and yet it still shaped me. I can't say that Fiddler on the Roof didn't shape me. And it's one of the sort of, I think, most key narratives that exists in popular understandings of who the Jewish diaspora is. I think later in life, seeing Rebecca Teichman and Paula Vogel's Indecent on Broadway was an extraordinary experience for me. I thought that was an absolutely beautiful play and representation of the Jewish diaspora. But again, this is not my Jewish diaspora, right? And even this idea of shared experiences of the Jewish diaspora purports that we have shared experiences in the Jewish diaspora, right? And actually, perhaps there are some, but the experiences of Jews in my family in Iraq are so tremendously different from the experiences of Jews in other parts of the world in those moments. And I speak just for my own family, but for many, many Middle Eastern and North African Jews, that's a similar case, right? Their stories are very specific and unique, and we have so few popular representations of those stories that exist whatsoever. So that's part of my life's work, is to bring forth some of those stories, to bring forth some of that work, to really, really create a robust canon of our stories, because, even the Iraqi Jewish dialect of Arabic is dying out. I'm part of a Facebook group with 70,000 Iraqi Jews that's called in Hebrew, Preserving the Iraqi Jewish Dialect. And people will post a word and ask how to say it. And then the folks in the generation who remember how to speak that dialect will respond. But, we're losing this dialect, we're losing access to these stories, we're losing access to these histories because they weren't documented and resourced and funded as well as so many Eastern European and Central European histories of Jewish communities. And that isn't to say that those histories and documenting, creating stories about those histories isn't extraordinarily transformative. Fiddler was extraordinarily transformative for me. Indecent was extraordinarily transformative. And I'm looking for myself to continue to be represented. And so I'm doing that in community with my artists and cultural workers that I work alongside. And that's part of what I work on steadily and regularly. There are some amazing books about Iraqi Jewish history, though, which, if you're interested, I can share the titles at some point. But there are a lot of works that exist. And I've been studying Arabic over the past many years. And even recently, I was able to actually read a little bit of Iraqi Jewish dialect in the original Arabic from different poets, Samir Naqash, different folks like this. And that's been an enormous unlocking for me to actually be able to access some of these histories, but it's come at great painstaking labor. And to actually understand my history has come at great cost and has been a great challenge. Whereas access to my Ashkenazi roots and my Ashkenazi history, which is also a part of my story, has come very easily. So just to put that into the space that it is continuously difficult to access those stories. The memories of Baghdad are fading. Fragments of those memories barely exist at this point. And I teach ancestral storytelling workshops to Jews of color and to Sephardi Mizrahi Jews about when we have these gaps in our histories, what do we do? And what do the fragments of our stories offer? And how do we look for story within those fragments? So.
Right. Well, I just have to say that I attended a seminar at noon today on Baghdadi Jews in the interwar period. So
that's great.
So even certainly in academia and the writing of Jewish history and the study of Jewish history, there is an attempt to remedy this Ashkenazification. But I should say it's also true in the writing of American Jewish history. The Mizrahi Sephardi Jews who came to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries from the Ottoman Empire have just been left out. They have not been included in the standard narratives. So thank you for that, Sivan. Melanie.
Sandy, did you want to take your turn? No. I'm very impressed with everything you young folks are saying. I'm from a different generation. I have decades on most of you here. Philip Roth and Herman Wouk were the writers that sort of shaped my early days.
Me too, me too.
Oh, okay, that makes me feel a little more like I belong. The book Marjorie Morningstar was made into a film, and in a terrible, egregious case of cultural misappropriation played by Natalie Wood. And then there was a book by Philip Roth made into a film called Goodbye Columbus, which starred Ali MacGraw, also a terrible misappropriation of the Jewish culture. So these sorts of books shaped me. There was a lot of Jap talk, you know, when I was a young woman, about the materialism, about how the suddenly nouveau riche daddies of this generation in the 50s and 60s made their daughters into trophies of materialism. They straightened their noses, they straightened their hairs, they straightened their teeth, and made them worthy of Jewish men, but they didn't make them worthy of careers of their own. So a lot of the films in the 70s and 80s had to do with, you know, Private Benjamin and Dirty Dancing, about young women who were raised to be Japs suddenly seeing the error in their father's ways and coming into a social consciousness. And I think my peers now are pretty socially conscious. If they were ever Japs, the women I know who are in the Jewish community here and also online are some of the most woke women I've ever met. They're philanthropic, humanitarians. They're incredibly generous, and not to keep up with the Joneses. They're doing this from a sincere care about the planet. I feel the Jewish culture, as you said, Sivan, is very dispersed and very unique. And one of my big privileges in being part of this Jewish women's theater outfit is that we have stories from Latina Jews and Iraqi Jews, Persian Jews, certainly, which populate a lot of Los Angeles. And you see there's a common thread of care, humanity, heimisha, mushbuka kind of like feelings of our origin countries. But they are generated from different cultures completely, dressing differently, different rituals. So it's really a fascinating time to try to hang on to your Judaism in this morphing virtual culture.
Thank you for all of these answers. It's so great. I agree with a lot of what you guys were saying. I think for me, it wasn't hard. It hasn't been hard to find characters that are, you know, supposed to be Ashkenazi New Yorkers on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's really taken until very recently for there to be more nuanced depictions of Jewish women. I think you brought up all of these kinds of pop culture elements that had to do with Jap culture, and that still exists today. You also see still in the media that very few parts, like characters for Jewish women in major films or TV shows are even played by Jewish women, although that's also getting better. I think like a turning point for me in terms of seeing something that looked like a more complex set of Jewish characters on TV, I would say Crazy Ex-Girlfriend was one of them. It was an amazing musical comedy TV show with Rachel Bloom, whose character is half Jewish. That's her terminology for it, but seems to relate more to the Jewish side in a lot of ways. And just seeing that part being played by a curvy, brash Jewish woman, as opposed to, and I like Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, don't get me wrong, it's a good show, but you know, it's an okay show. It's hard to see, you know, Rachel Brosnahan playing that role a little bit sometimes. So I think like it's still a process, but in terms of just female depiction, Jewish females on and queer characters also on TV, we still have a long way to go, but it's starting to get better.
Well, let me, you know, as the three of you are speaking and you're saying so many interesting things, one aspect that occurred to me is that so far all of you have emphasized, the three of you have emphasized diversity and disparity. You know, in Sandy's case, the diversity or tension between Israel and the diaspora, or Israel and the United States. In Sivan's case, between the Ashkenazi experience and the Mizrahi experience. In Melanie's case, between different generations. What about if we flip the coin? What are the similarities that make it possible for those experiences to be shared between Israel and the diaspora, between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim or Sephardim, between Jews of my and Melanie's generation and a younger generation of Jews. Who wants to have a crack at that?
Well, I'll say one thing to kick us
Please.
off. I am a tri-state Jewess, and I have never felt like Israel was my country. I've read up on it, I've studied up, I've gone through the heartbreaks over and over again with my people. And I've known a lot of Israeli people in New York and in Los Angeles, and they don't feel as much like my people as the New Yorkers do, Jewish or non. It's just not an affinity. There's not an affinity that we share. So that has always made me feel a little bit alienated from the mood of my culture, wanting to save Israel, preserve Israel, celebrate Israel. So that is one aspect of my sort of disassociation from Israel that's been very confusing for me. I'm almost ashamed to talk about it because so many family members are so zealous, about Israel. There's certain strata of Jewish society that I really identify with, the people that are up from the streets, not the extremely rich philanthropic people that you only see figureheads and names on buildings. My people are boots on the ground kind of Jewish people participating in charity and theater. So I'm a little bit isolated perhaps from the real mise en scène of the Jewish culture.
Sivan? Oh, Sandy, go ahead.
Sure. I was going to say that I think that what I sense when I'm in Israel is that actually a lot of young Israelis are looking for their pre-Israel roots too. There is a meeting place for that, whether that's Mizrahi culture or Ashkenazi culture or anything in between. So I think that's one place where there's actually some similarity more so than differences, that this generation in Israel doesn't have, I guess, the complex that other generations had about kind of exhibiting Israeliness. They are Israeli, they don't have to worry about that. And now there are more questions about how to engage with diaspora. So actually, for me, I think one of my goals when I am there, and that's like in an interpersonal way or in a scholarly way or an activist way, is to be talking about diaspora Jewish identity with Israelis, teaching Israelis when possible. I think like just in the case of like American Jewish history, a lot of Israelis don't even realize there is one, right? So I'll get into a taxi and the taxi driver will ask me where my family's from. And of course they think that I have to have a grandparent that's not from, is not from the place I'm from. But my grandparents and even some of my great grandparents were born in America. That starts a whole conversation and there's interest there. But it takes a long time for these ideas to come through. I actually just saw that there's a very well-known, I forgot his name, a well-known comedian or TV personality, I'm not really sure, who's doing like a several part series on American Jewish life on one of Israel's biggest networks. So it shows that there's actually some interest in more understanding. And obviously the relationship between American Jews and Israel is strained for a whole host of political reasons, American Jewry being more liberal, generally speaking. And in my generation, it's very shocking that young Israelis tend to be more right-wing than their parents. And obviously in America, it's the opposite. But you do kind of see slowly but surely that people are understanding that there needs to be cultural understanding too, that the American Jews can't simply exist to fund Israel and be rah-rah cheerleaders for it, but it's a relationship on both sides. So it's an interesting time, I think, in the relationship, and it remains to be seen how much the problems of the past couple of years and even decades will be repaired between Americans and Israelis. But I do think there's room for some sort of dialogue.
Thanks, everyone. There are so many categories to respond to right now, so I'm going to try to crystallize my thoughts a bit, but it might be a bit rambly. But I think the first thing I'll say is, like, I do not believe that Israel is a uniting factor for Jewish peoples. I don't believe that it's a default assumption that as Jews locally, diaspora, wherever we are, that we should support Israel or should stand by Israel. I resist that notion, particularly as a person whose family history and whose Mizrahi communities' histories were so dramatically harmed by the state of Israel, by both the founding of the state of Israel and the practices that exist, and as a person who has spent a great deal of time and of my life working towards Palestinian liberation and paying attention to the ways in which the systems of Zionism have caused such extraordinary harm, both in Mizrahi communities and in Palestinian communities and in Ethiopian communities and in countless other communities, mostly other than white Ashkenazi Jewish communities for whom the state was, I would go so far as to say the state was ultimately founded. And so I think it's complex for me to think of Israel as a uniting factor for Jewish people. I also think the nature of the word diaspora, right? Like in Jewish communities, we use that as a default, we use that to mean that from the diaspora of the state of Israel. I'm more interested in a shifting of the locus of diaspora to say, like, I am diaspora. I can be Iraqi diaspora. I am of the Iraqi diaspora. And in fact, I'm in a Facebook group for Iraqi artists, right? Not Iraqi Jewish artists. I'm in a Facebook group for Iraqi artists living in the Iraqi diaspora, right? So this idea of the locus of Jewish diaspora being centralized around Israel, I resist that. My family was in Israel for one generation. My father was born in Jerusalem. For 1,500 years before that, my family was born in Baghdad and Basra a little bit. We moved around in Iraq a little bit, but we had 1,500 years in this one place, 1,500 years of speaking Aramaic, Arabic, and then one generation in which I was completely erased from access to my Arabic. I was completely erased from access to my Arabness in general. And it was replaced with this idea of a hegemonic Israeli identity, right? Like, we are Israeli now. And I think it makes sense that the first generation within that, so my father's generation or the generation just above me, would say, like, we have to assimilate and culturally assimilate in order to become Israeli and to become accepted in this place, particularly for Mizrahi Jews. But I think it was the case also for Ashkenazi Jews of like shedding certain aspects of pre-1948 identity in order to become part of this national identity. And that the generation below would be saying, let's reclaim and let's find and let's re-speak these tongues and let's cook these foods and let's call ourselves who we are. I think the Israeli project is not to have that happen. I don't see the project of the state of Israel being to support that work. I see there are moments, right? There are moments, right? There was a bringing of Mizrahi history into the Israeli national curriculum in the last couple of years. There are places like, the Yiddish book library and the Tachanat Merkazit in the central bus station in Tel Aviv, which is one of the most extraordinary spaces. It's the largest, I'm sure that Sandy can speak much better, more eloquently about this place than I, but, one of the largest collections of Yiddish books in the entire world. There's a Musrara teaching Arabic music in Piyutim in Jerusalem. There are places where this work is happening, but I wouldn't say it's part of the project of the state of Israel. Anyway, to circle back to your question, which is about shared experiences, I'm not sure that I believe that there is like a central Jewish experience. I've been in the last few months, I'm a part of the Laba Fellowship at the 14th Street Y, and we've been returning to core texts of Jewish identity. And sort of, I spent last night studying Exodus, I spent last night studying the Mount Sinai, the receiving of the commandments at Har Sinai, and like what those moments mean for the Jewish peoplehood, and what they mean about this question. The Laba program I'm in this year, our topic is chosenness, what it means to be the chosen people. And I think I resist that notion quite strongly. I resist the notion that we are a chosen people, and I resist the notion that we would have one central experience of Jewishness. I think our journeys are so vast and robust, and we are not one peoplehood anymore. And perhaps we were at one time, but we're not now. And there are things in our holiday tradition that I think ground me in the experience of being Jewish and the sort of global experience of Jewishness. But in terms of culturally, I certainly wouldn't think there's anything beyond religious practice and certain forms of that. But even that varies so widely. So I think I'm more interested in complicating than in collapsing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what you're all saying is interesting about the overwhelming centrality of Israel for so many Jews in the United States for their Jewish identity, but also the varied experiences of Jews in Israel, in which I think it wouldn't be incorrect to talk about Israel containing many diasporas and diasporas continuing within Israel itself. But to go back to this notion of diaspora, let's go back to storytelling in diaspora. Talk about how being part of the Jewish diaspora affects the stories you tell and how you tell them, or tell us a story that includes Jewish diaspora that's close to your heart. Who wants to go first? I'm not going to call on anybody.
Oh, Sandy, you go first.
I think that for me, it's more about the how I tell the stories than exactly what the stories are. So I guess I tell two kinds of stories. I'm a historian, and historians tell sorts of stories. But I think I want to focus more on the podcast I do, which is, as you mentioned in the introduction, it's called Battat. It's a feminist-oriented podcast in Yiddish. And what's important about it to me is that it's in Yiddish. It's for a Yiddish-speaking audience. It's not trying to be for everyone, although anyone who wants to learn Yiddish and be able to understand it, I love that. But to me, it's very important to give a platform to women and queer folk in particular, whose stories in Yiddish have not really been told, both, I mean, like in a historical perspective, when we think about the great Yiddish authors and playwrights, of course, there were women involved, but not usually the ones that come straight to mind. And also, I mean, in the contemporary space, it just so happens that a lot of the dominant voices when I entered the Yiddish world just about 10 years ago were men. And I noticed this pattern that when women were learning Yiddish, generally speaking, they were hesitant to speak until they felt that they were fluent enough to do so. And I didn't see the same hesitation among men. And so I wanted to give a platform to people in the Yiddishist community that were experiencing that kind of silencing that is sort of, it's kind of the same as what we hear about, you know, in terms of gender dynamics in the classroom, the same reason why you have to give space sometimes for students of different kinds to speak up, because some people raise their hands quickly and some people don't. And there are tendencies that are gendered, there are tendencies that are from other reasons as well. And I noticed that with Yiddish. So to me, it's really important to provide this platform to give people a chance to tell their personal life stories in Yiddish. Specifically, I like to do life stories and stories about everyday things, and not conversations that have to do with Yiddish. So it's not that none of the podcasts have to do with Yiddish, but the point is to speak about other things using the language itself. So whether that's, you know, speaking to someone who designs the bottles at Estee Lauder about how product design works, which is fascinating, or talking to a midwife about, you know, reproductive justice, doing those conversations in Yiddish really inspires me, and I think inspires the people who can listen to it, which turns out to be not an insignificant number of people, thankfully. So
Want to just speak a few lines of Yiddish for us, talking about I don't know, zooming on Long Wharf Theater, or
I don't know what to say though. Ich weiß nicht was zu sagen. Yeah.
Great. Okay, Melanie.
You can hear my Yiddish voice at viberteich.com.
Okay, great. Melanie.
Once upon a time, there was a woman in her 60s that wanted to be married. So she went on J-Date, and one of the first guys that seemed desirable, she picked. And they hit it off so famously with the first 4-hour dinner that he decided to take her to Seder the following weekend at his family's in Newport Beach. And she was sort of nervous because you don't usually want to meet the guy's family in the first trimester of a relationship, you know, just in case it goes wrong. So we came into his affluent aunt's house in Newport Beach, and the entire family was there, cousins, uncles. Here I was going to get the whole smorgasbord of my husband-to-be's family. And when he introduced me to his daughter, this feeling ran through me of, oh my goodness, this is the important relationship here. She was tall, she was at Stanford, she was brilliant. I didn't feel I could mother this girl. There was no way I would get this girl into my lap or have her sitting at my knee learning from me, because she was just a brilliant girl. She knew all the gender pronouns. She actually, her life's work was to work as a social worker with people who are changing genders in one direction or another. Anyway, I got an enormous crush on her, and her father left us alone, which was good, so I could get to know her and her fiance, who was also brilliant. He had been inducted by Apple to work there and was about to move to Google. I mean, these are just brilliant kids with their heads on their shoulders, unlike other kids whose heads have a tendency to roll off. I could tell these kids were solid. And, I kept doing these speeches and prayers with the family, like, why is this night different from all other nights? Because I'm in love with this guy's daughter before I even know the guy. So the happy outcome of this is I went to several Seders over the years to come, and they gave me more portions of the Haggadah to read, which is a good sign. I was apparently not the first Jewish woman that this man had brought to have his family check out at Seder. It became quite clear it was kind of I was running the gauntlet there. But anyway, I was accepted by the family and married into it soon later. And I am still crazy about his daughter, who I don't see often enough. Certainly during pandemic, it's been very hard. She's up at Stanford, her husband's at Google. But anyway, that was a kind of a love story that worked out.
Great, thank you for that. Sivan.
Sure, I'll tell a story about just before the pandemic began, January of last year, before it all began. I was on a trip to Morocco and Tunisia, to North Africa, with two other Mizrahi friends. One is Syrian Jewish and one is Moroccan Jewish. And we went on this trip, this Jewish history tour, to visit as many Jewish sites as we could and to try to take in some of the, Jewish history in North Africa. Visited, places where my Moroccan Jewish friend's family had lived and were buried and prayed at. And when we were at one particular Jewish cemetery in Fez, we met an older man named Edmund Gabay. And we had already been to the Jewish Museum of Casablanca and in the capital of Morocco. And that had artifacts behind glass kind of feeling of a museum that was curated to tell a particular story about the Jews of Morocco. And at this other place, at the cemetery in Fez, we met this man who was in his 80s named Edmund. He didn't speak much English, and I don't speak much French, which is the colonial language in Morocco. And my mostly Levantine Arabic doesn't go so far in North Africa, where the dialect is very, very different. So we couldn't communicate so well, but we eventually expressed that we wanted to go into this room that seemed to be a museum. And so he first had to look around. We figured it out. He had to look around for the keys for like half an hour. He hadn't let anyone into this museum of sorts in goodness knows how long. He finally finds the keys. He gives us this little paper ticket that looked like it was faded. It was like from 40 years ago, this ticket. And I'm like, do I need a ticket if you're going to walk me? It was just a hilarious experience. So then we walk over to these doors and he unlocks like 3 padlocks and this huge, big wooden doors swing open. And there's just like 4 rooms in this, what was clearly an old synagogue, because you could see above where the bima is dalif neim yata omed, which means it's like a classic thing they put above the bima in a synagogue, know before who you stand, right above where you keep the Torah. So it was clearly a synagogue. And the room was filled with objects from the Moroccan Jewish community, things that got left behind. And it was kind of like, it wasn't organized. The tables were like cluttered with phones and Torahs and Sidurim and kaftans, Moroccan traditional attire. And I mean, the rooms were just packed and dusty and totally chaotic, photo albums everywhere. And I just stood in this room and began to weep, because I was like, this is the artifacts of an entire community. And this man who was Jewish and in his 80s and clearly didn't leave for whatever reason, when almost all of his community around him in Fez left for different places, mostly in the 1940s and 50s, the Jewish communities in Morocco left. He didn't, and he gathered up all of the things that were left behind and just put them in this room. And I heard, people in different communities kind of call him a hoarder, but I was obsessed with this room and with these rooms, because each of these objects had so much story to them. And I was just weeping and weeping. And my Syrian friend and I both looked at each other and wondered, is there a room like this in Aleppo? Is there a room like this in Baghdad? Did someone gather up the things that our families left behind? So I started writing a play called The Jewish Museum of Baghdad, which is kind of imagining if there was someone who did gather up the things that my family left behind and just hoarded them in this enormous room, things that my family lived over, dishes that my great-grandmother might have cooked rice in and served, and the telephone that I know our family had, in those years, which was such a big deal, and all of these things. So that was one piece that I really hold close. And when I teach ancestral storytelling workshops, I often ground that work in ancestral objects. Like, what is an object that you have that is ancestral to you in some way, whether that's a memory of an object or a true object, and to actually see those objects dusty and abandoned, but in the place where they came from, it was like diaspora, but localized. So it was a really powerful moment in which Baghdad really went from a fictional geography for me into a real one.
Yeah, it's almost like a modern version of the Cairo Geniza, but being a deliberate Geniza, right? The Cairo Geniza, in this attic in the Cairo synagogue, there was 1,000 years of manuscripts and books that had just been thrown up there that people thought would never be rediscovered or used, but you couldn't get rid of the letters and manuscripts and books because they were in Hebrew and were holy. And so it was kind of this unintentional collection of memory, whereas here you have a deliberate collection of memory and a deliberate attempt to maintain it. I have another question for you. Are there moments in your creative practices where you've felt especially connected to the Jewish diaspora? Can you talk about an especially powerful one or a recent one? Sivan, go ahead.
I'm happy to start. A few years ago, I organized the first kind of enormous leftist radical Mimuna in Brooklyn. Mimuna is a tradition from North Africa, from Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, that was historically at the end of Passover. Jews would give their leavened products to their Muslim neighbors, and then in the last hour of Passover, they would throw a huge party and make these quick pancakes called mufleta and have a huge party in the streets. And so JFREJ, which is the Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, which is an organization in New York, a Jewish organization that focuses on domestic racial and economic justice work that I organize with, we threw a huge Mimuna in Brooklyn in partnership with the Arab American Association in Bay Ridge. We got this huge catering hall in Bay Ridge. We got, I don't know, $2,000 worth of baklava and basbousa. We had musicians. Galit Dardashti played, who's an extraordinary Persian musician and scholar and academic, and just had a huge party with storytellers. And I creative directed this event, bringing together ritual performance, actually the performance of actually breaking the Pesach for our chametz, having the blessings of that, having storytellers and musicians. And it was just like, it was like an abundant experience of liberation and what liberation can look like for Mizrahi Jews, and to have so much of our non-Jewish Arab community there in the audience and in the partnership partying with us was such a huge gift. And I think about that night so fondly. We were like, 400 people crammed in a tiny room, and I wonder if that kind of thing will ever be able to happen again, truly. But I hold it really near and dear in my heart, and it was a moment when I felt deeply, deeply connected to my Jewish diaspora. Even as right, I'm Iraqi, I'm not Moroccan at all. And actually there's a lot of matrices of privilege that exist within the Mizrahi community too. But the event was spearheaded by 2 Moroccan Jews in our community who wanted to bring it forth and asked me if I would sort of use my skills as a theater director and ritual builder to launch this event. So we built it together, and it was really beautiful.
Thank you for sharing that. Melanie.
For a change of pace, I was hired to play the daughter-in-law of Kirk Douglas on an episode that he wrote he wrote an episode about turning 82 and having his second bar mitzvah. And the odd thing was that we were in Salt Lake City shooting this on location, which is the seat of the Mormon temple. And it felt so odd to be telling this very Jewish story in Salt Lake City. But I was very moved by Kirk's dedication to his Judaism and his sincerity about having a bar mitzvah, again, going through the entire ritual and saying his Haftorah with my child in the episode, who was resisting having a bar mitzvah, who didn't believe in God because his dad had just died of brain cancer. And the way that Kirk, in his writing and in his performance, and this is a man who'd had many strokes and was not in the best of shape, how his Judaism, his faith, and his love fired him up. He was incredibly charismatic in this episode. And he talked my son into having his bar mitzvah with his grandfather. And I just felt it was a beautiful story to put across, and I was very happy to be part of it.
Great, wonderful. Sandy?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a lot of different moments. I the concept of diaspora comes up for me a lot in both my writing and my podcasting. I think for me, the first thing that came to mind is my first summer learning Yiddish. I learned Yiddish at the Yiddish Farm in upstate New York, in Goshen, which is a wonderful place to visit if you're in the, upstate, in that area for the summer. And it's an immersive program, so I got there and wasn't allowed to use English. And I think for me, that experience of learning a language that was technically foreign but didn't feel foreign at all, like in a way that I didn't feel about any other language I'd ever learned prior, was quite an awakening for me. It made me feel really connected to my diaspora heritage. But I think more recently, and this is kind of an interesting, more unexpected thing, once in a while I do an episode of Vibertage in English if there's someone I really want to connect with on a theme that's related to feminism or queer Jewish issues or something of that nature. So there's an amazing Iranian Jewish podcaster and performance artist named Sharon Mashihi, who I've followed for many years, and the podcast she was involved in called The Heart, or is still involved in actually, was one of the inspirations for me making Vibertage. And so I decided to talk to her about her new show, which is called Appearances, and it's worth listening to if anyone's into podcasts. And at that moment where we were talking, of course, it was on Zoom, but what was so amazing about it is she's from Great Neck, New York. I'm from another part of Long Island. My mom grew up right next to Great Neck. There were all these points of connection and these ways in which our family's histories had actually met, and that our connections to diaspora were really actually rather similar, different, but also similar. And I think for me, it was a really amazing opportunity to connect over Jewish diaspora from two different perspectives, and learn more about her experience growing up Iranian in an area that I know from an Ashkenazi perspective.
Great, thank you. Well, look, this has been a remarkably exhilarating conversation. The three of you are wonderful storytellers and artists. Before we end, I'd just like to give you each the opportunity to say something in conclusion. Anything you want to talk about, anything you want to say, a story you want to tell, stories you think that too often get omitted that you want to point to. Sivan.
I'll just name that, we are three for individuals who have our own experiences, but there's such a wealth of other Jewish experiences that exist. And, as a board member of a Torah Academy specifically for Jews of color, so often the dominant picture of who is a Jew in the United States, for most people looks like an upper middle class white Ashkenazi person. And that's not the case for all of our Jewish communities whatsoever. And I just want to lift up that we have so many Jews of so many different backgrounds with so many different stories and diaspora histories in our communities, and we're as diverse and as the fabrics of our communities are as diverse as any other. And so I just wanted to lift that up as, we're just four speakers of our specific identities, but there are so many others.
Thank you for that, Sivan. Melanie?
Well, I don't have any profound thing to add, except that I feel the need for education after talking to all of you to continue, not necessarily in a Hebrew school, but in the culture. And that although we are four very diverse people representing our groups, there's a warmth and a desire for knowledge that seems to be a common thread in the Jewish race. And I'm happy to be part of that, always growing, always learning, always reaching, always trying to better the world, trying to be inclusive. So that leaves me with a very nice feeling. Thank you for letting me participate.
Thank you, Melanie. Sandy?
Yeah, I guess I'll just end. First of all, I want to echo what Sivan said about just, it's a lot to kind of represent parts of the Jewish people as, one person or as four people, and there are so many other voices. What I often like to say when I have a public platform is that, I learned Yiddish as an adult or as a young adult. I was, I guess, 23 when I started. And now I'm a fluent speaker who plans to speak it with like future children and make that a major part of my life. And I guess I always like to say that if there's a language, an ancestral language, whether that's a Jewish language or not, that you think it would be nice to know, but it doesn't feel possible or doesn't feel always like you have the time for it. If you can find the time for it, the rewards are really, really major. And I think that like in America, just when you're a native English speaker, it can be really easy to fall into a trap of thinking like, well, I already have the most useful language in the world. Why do I need to know Yiddish or Judeo-Arabic or Ladino? And the truth is because there's a wealth of culture and knowledge and emotion that you can't access without those languages. And that not everything is utilitarian in the same way as, okay, English you need in order to have a job, in order to do this, but I think language really deepens your life in a way that can be missed if you don't enter that world. So if it's Yiddish, there's now Yiddish Duolingo, which is a very popular language learning app. I think already downloaded as of last week, like 160,000 people, which is,
Wow.
I mean, not all of them will stick with it, but even if a tiny fraction does, it's kind of tremendous. So hopefully more Jewish languages on Duolingo will appear sometime.
Sivan.
Just here to say there's also an Arabic Duolingo. It dropped a little before Yiddish and it's pretty good. It's like at the intersection of modern standard, but sort of speakable. So if you're looking to learn Arabic, the Duolingo is great too.
Right. Well, I think what you're all pointing to is that being monolingual also tends to make one monocultural, and that it's in all of our interests to be multilingual and multicultural in the best sense of the word, to realize that our own experiences, however important and wonderful, are always limited, and that there are other experiences out there in the world, in the Jewish diaspora in Israel, etc., that we need to learn about in order to expand our own understanding and our own conceptual and emotional universe. So I'd like to thank the three of you, Sandy, Sivan, and Melanie. It's been a pleasure speaking with the three of you. I appreciate your candor, your energy, and your verve. I thank you for expanding everyone's experience of Jewish diaspora, and for making us think about things from new perspectives and in new ways. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and good night. And thank you to Long Wharf Theater for hosting this.